All right, welcome back to the channel. I'm having fun with this topic, watching it closely. Gary Russell Jr. goes in again on Terence Crawford, calls him the cowardly lion, and tells another story about how he punked Terence Crawford. It's like, man, Gary, how many stories you got about punking Terence Crawford? Let's talk about what Gary Russell Jr. said. And Gary Russell Jr. is right about a couple things that he says in here, man. Pay attention and get a man his credit. Let's talk about that in this video. All right, welcome back to the channel. Gary Russell Jr., Mr. Gary Russell Jr., the 126-pound WBC champion, longest reigning champion in boxing, the most ducked fighter right now, top 3 ducked fighters in boxing, down there at 126 pounds, getting later on in his career and trying to find something to cement his legacy. Gary Russell Jr. has been a professional fighter probably his whole life, right? As long as he can remember, he's been in a boxing gym. Him, his brothers, trained by his father, million brothers with the same name. All these dudes in DC, in the DC area, if they're not still actually in the city of DC, you know, doing their thing, man. In the amateurs, in the pros, champion, all that good stuff, but yet does not get nearly the respect that Gary Russell Jr. deserves as an excellent fighter, as a highly skilled fighter. Gary Russell Jr. should be on the top 10 pound for pound list by any measure, especially when you consider the other people that are on that list and the skill sets they possess versus the skill sets that Gary Russell Jr. possesses. Regardless, Gary Russell Jr. says, hey, man, I am going to seek out greatness. I want to prove that I can move up and beat bigger guys. I want to prove that I can move up from 126 pounds to 147 pounds and win a belt. And I want to do it against Terence Crawford, right? So he calls out Terence Crawford, tells a story about how Terence Crawford, you know, how he broke Terence Crawford's jaw, trying to goad the dude into a fight. Of course, Terence Crawford, like anybody, like cases where anybody asks for a fight with Terence Crawford, Terence Crawford tells him no and laughs at him and gives him a million reasons why he doesn't deserve it and he's too busy and all of this, all of that, right? About not making the fight. Now, if from Terence Crawford's perspective, if it was just Gary Russell Jr. that he did that to, I would be like, okay, yeah, maybe he's just laughing at a guy that's a lot smaller than him. But no, you're doing it to everybody, man. You're doing it to I can't get off this. You did it to Ray Robinson. You did it to Kell Brook. I mean, not Kell Brook. You did it to Ray Robinson. You did it to Sean Porter. You did it to Keith Thurman. You did it to Danny Garcia. So I don't believe it's about a weight class. I believe it's just that you only want to fight Errol Spence Jr. for a cash out fight. But Gary Russell Jr. is not giving up. And that's the subject matter of the video because he's just doubling down on Terence Crawford and saying, look, man, you ain't got to fight. But since you want to keep talking about how I sucker punched you, loved the story he told you. He said, since you want to talk about how you got sucker punched and all, Gary Russell Jr. is saying that he broke the jaw of Terence Crawford. There was a lot of stuff going on, a lot of back and forth about it. In this particular thing, in this particular talk, he doesn't go into the jaw breaking thing, but he says, look, man, you all want to act like, first of all, Terence Crawford is a female dog, right? Basically what he called him, female dog, called a bunch of these dudes female dogs and told a story. He said, this is another example why, like I'm telling you, Terence Crawford don't want no smoke with me. He said, Terence Crawford's always been, this is Gary Russell Jr. talking, not me. Gary Russell Jr. lets into a real ether on the dude's personality. It's like, look, man, he's always been like that. And y'all some suckers too. That's why I can see why you guys are some Terence Crawford fans because you're acting just like him. But the story was funny because he said, look, man, I'll give you another story and tell you, where I punked him again. Like, where I punked him before. Not just the jaw breaking, but another time. He says that it was at that they were at an amateur tournament. Gary Russell Jr. got like 900 brothers, and one of his brothers were fighting at the 152-pound weight class, right? And he was losing a fight. Gary Russell Jr. was sitting on the bleachers. He said that Terence Crawford and somebody else were sitting above him on the bleachers, but close enough to him where he could hear him. And the Gary Russell Jr. That Terence Crawford and the other guy must have been talking smack about the brother, talking about how they would beat him and he was garbage. Must have been something like that, because it got Gary Russell Jr. out of his seat. So Gary says he walked up to he's turned around. He said, "What you say?" And they're like, "Nah, man, I'm not talking to you. I'm not talking to you." So he's like, "All right." And they went back to watching the fight. I guess he said he heard something else again. So this time he went up and walked over to Terence Crawford and whoever he's with. He's like, "Man, what'd you say?" He's like, "What you say?" And then it's like, "Nothing, man. I ain't say nothing." He's like, "Yeah, you said something? You gonna say it? Say it now." And they said, "Man, we didn't say nothing." He's like, "Yeah, like I thought." All right. He's like I thought, and walked away. He's like, "Yeah, man, because if they wanted to be about it, they would have. If they were about it, I jumped in, I got in his face, then he would have done something then, but he didn't." Now, to me, this is interesting because this is very, very DC. Okay, this is very, it might be very Chicago too, very New Orleans too, but that scenario right there is very, 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 very Chicago, very, very DC. I was in DC for a while, and Gary Russell Jr. wanted to fight. Okay, Gary Russell Jr. walked up to him and said that Gary Russell Jr. was prepared to fight. So that's the reason he's like, "Man, you guys think this dude is all brave and big and bad, and he's supposed to destroy me in 5 rounds." He's like, "You guys don't understand the personality of Terence Crawford. Terence Crawford don't want no smoke with me. Terence Crawford is this, that, and the other," right? So, dude, I'm like, look, man, I think Terence Crawford is the #1 pound-for-pound fighter in the world. I say it every video. Said it in this video. Think he's the #1 pound-for-pound in boxing. I'm convinced that he beats Gary Russell Jr. in a fight. Convinced. Like, I don't have any doubt that Terence Crawford will win that fight. However, Terence Crawford's response to it, it's a sucker move. Okay, it's a sucker move. You know that this dude is a legitimate fighter. He's Gary Russell Jr. It's not like Nonito Donaire is trying to get a fight with Terence Crawford. You know what I'm saying? Somebody that's getting sparked out of his own weight class. This is a world-class dude who should have the right to lose a fight. And aside from the Terence Crawford thing, and I'm gonna continue to harp on this. In boxing, over the last couple years, you're consistently having people being commended for setting records that nobody asked them to set. Take Mikey Garcia, for example. Mikey Garcia said he wanted to move up to fight Errol Spence Jr. because he wanted to be the first person to win belts in 3 weight classes within a 8-month span or 12-month span. Like who's keeping that record? Who's watching to see, oh, well, let's see how many divisions you can get. Oh, well, the clock is you better get this fight in within the next 2 months. Nobody acting like that. But, Mikey Garcia goes up, fights Errol Spence Jr., gets beaten pillar to post, and no loss in his career. He's in negotiation to fight Manny Pacquiao. It's like he didn't miss a step, right? How many weight classes did Manny Pacquiao go up? Manny Pacquiao moved up from 105, right? So what's the problem? He was at 130 and he moved up to 147 from 130 very, very fast. It was only maybe 2 fights at 135, 1 fight at 140, and he was at 147. So people saying that he didn't, that's only really 1 weight class difference between when Manny Pacquiao won a belt, came to the United States and beat actually I think at the time he might have fought Eric Morales and those guys at 130 pounds. Shoot, dude's at Gary Russell Jr.'s at 126. So what should prevent Gary Russell Jr. from jumping on a bunch of steroids and going to fly up a couple weight classes? It's interesting, that everybody else is trying to create these records. As long as you got a media company behind you trying to help you sell it, everybody's okay with it, right? But Gary Russell Jr. wants to do something that seems like a big stretch, and and he's the bad guy, and he's to be laughed at. It's just it doesn't make sense to me. However, we wouldn't have any of this. We probably would not have any of these problems if it was not for sanctioning bodies having the fact that there are 4 sanctioning bodies, right, that have like 5 champions per weight division. Right? Take example of WBC, who's got like the gold belt, the diamond belt, gold belt, the diamond belt, the franchise belt, the regular belt, right? All of this garbage. You got the WBA super, the WBA regular, all of this stuff where these guys don't have to fight the best to call themselves champions. So you find yourself in a situation where Gary Russell Jr. is completely avoided in the weight class that he's the best at because there's so many belts for these guys to duck him with, right? So he doesn't get the fights. And now you want to keep the guy from going up in weight class and doing the only thing that's really available to him, which is to take bigger risks and fight bigger guys. And fighting some bigger guy for the same amount of money that he's fighting a little guy doesn't make sense. Terence Crawford is not going to take this fight, obviously, because Terence Crawford ain't about to fight anybody. And he's not fighting any fresh fighters. I'm convinced about that. You're not gonna hear, oh yeah, Ugas is next. After whoever he gets next, like Kell Brook, and I'm duty bound to tell you that I'm okay with the Kell Brook fight, but that dude, that's like lower expectations. That's like your son coming home with a C and you happy that it's not an F, right? Like, oh man, thanks, guy. You got a C? Man, just as long as I don't see, it's lowered expectations, right? You see your son's report card all the time, and it's like, dang. Get your grades together, right? And he's getting a bunch of D's, and all of a sudden you see a report card where it's not D's and C's, it's like 2 B's and 4 C's. You're like, yes, you're not failing. That's my thought about Kell Brook versus Terence Crawford. Yes, you're not failing. He's not a complete bum. He's just a has-been. You know what I mean? You're not fighting a bum, you're fighting a has-been. I'll take the has-been versus the never was, right? Like, he's going to actually wind up beating both of the dudes in the UK that wouldn't fight each other. Anyway, that's enough on that. That's my take on it, man. I don't mind if Gary Russell Jr. got the fight. I know Gary Russell is going to lose. I believe he's going to lose, but still, he gets the paycheck, and maybe he'll look vulnerable enough to get these little dudes in the ring with him. Anyway, that's my take on the matter. You let me know what you think, and with that, I'm out. Peace.